Today we have another very interesting story about a very unusual person. To simply call this case a survival story would probably be wrong, because this person's life was one continuous survival. The hero of our story today is Hugh Glass, and he was a trapper, or as they were sometimes called, a mountain man. To describe what trappers were at the dawn of the development of the American wilderness in a few words is impossible. Their main occupation was hunting fur-bearing animals. In those distant times, fur was a very valuable commodity, almost more expensive than gold. And in pursuit of the skins of ermine, sable, silver fox, and beaver, these desperate guys moved deeper and deeper into the wild lands of North America, to places where the foot of a white man had not yet set foot. They set traps, hunted, encountered Indian tribes, who had also not previously had contact with white people. These were truly desperate guys who often simply had no place on the big land, and they went to seek their fortune in the wild lands. Very soon, they realized that hunting fur-bearing animals themselves is not as profitable as trading furs with the Indians. All these events took place even before the California and Alaska gold rushes. In those years, fur was the basis of the economy of the North American colonies and brought in a really huge income, almost comparable to gold. And of course, all the countries that had colonies in those lands joined in this game. England, France, Holland. They created large enterprises for the extraction, processing, and sale of furs. But let's return to our mountain men. They spent years in the wild forests, hunted, set snares, moved from tribe to tribe, exchanging furs for iron pots, knives, gunpowder, steel needles, and other items that were more valuable to the Indians than any riches. Thus, from simple hunters, these guys become something like traveling traders. They moved between tribes, learning Indian languages and, more importantly, establishing contacts with them. Often they managed to establish contacts even with hostile tribes. If missionaries came to these tribes hoping to convert them to Christianity, they were often burned, scalped, and subjected to other terrible things. However, the tribes could maintain quite friendly relations with the trappers. In those distant times, mountain men were useful to all inhabitants of those wild lands, both Indians and the few whites who were gradually beginning to penetrate there. They were useful not only as a source of goods, but also as a source of news, because they traveled over fairly large territories, and they were also a very important link between the Indians and whites, because they knew the languages, had contacts, and could settle conflicts, disputes, and resolve some political situations. So what do we get in the end? A trapper or mountain man is a hunter, a trader, a person who navigates unfamiliar wild terrain, sometimes even creating maps, a person who knows the languages of local tribes, has contacts with them, and in general they were quite dashing guys. Subsequently, many of them served as guides for scientific expeditions, accompanied the first caravans of settlers, founded trading posts, and were hired as scouts in the U.S. Army. But we shouldn't idealize them too much. After all, they pursued their own personal goals and wanted to make money. And often they traded animal skins to the Indians for alcohol. The Indians, quickly becoming addicted to it, were ready to do anything just to get another bottle of firewater. They also hired themselves out as guides for punitive expeditions against the Indians, and there were cases when they sold blankets to the Indians. On these blankets, there had previously been smallpox patients. Entire tribes died from this. So they were dashing guys, but not angels at all. During the heyday of the fur trade in the 1820s, 1840s, there could have been only 3,000 mountain men. One of them was Hugh Glass, who became a true legend. Hugh Glass was born in 1783 in Philadelphia to the English family of William Glass, a successful stonemason. His family was not at all poor, and his father was able to give his children a decent education and persuaded his son to choose a career as a lawyer. However, Hugh had completely different plans for life. He was drawn to wild places and distant lands. His father was a wise man and tried to interest the boy in cartography and geodesy, which combined his son's craving for travel and could bring in a good income as a future profession. Young Hugh didn't agree to this, so his father relented and apprenticed him to a captain he knew in the trading company, Rose and Sons. At 16, Hugh Glass became a cabin boy on a sea vessel, and within 10 years had worked his way up to captain of the ship. In 1811, during the War of 1812, Hugh was smuggling rum and sugar. While waiting for his ship to be loaded in Havana, he received a letter from his mother, informing him of his father's death. Glass hurried home to settle all matters related to the inheritance. He traveled as a simple passenger on a Spanish merchant ship, but he was not destined to reach home. On the way to Philadelphia, their ship was captured by pirates. It sounds like the plot of some adventure novel, but it's really the life of this interesting man. Hugh Glass became a prisoner of the famous sea pirate Jean Lafitte, who ruled an entire pirate state, Campeche, on Galveston Island. The pirates appreciated our hero's education and his knowledge of navigation and cartography. At that time, such cadre were valued more than all the booty from a plundered ship, and for several years, Hugh served as a navigator on a pirate ship. Whether he was a prisoner there or a full-fledged member of the crew, history is silent, and Hugh Glass himself did not like to talk about it. In November 1820, the American Navy arrived in Campeche and dispersed this entire pirate den. Glass began to make his way home to the north. On the way, he was arrested by the Spaniards, but the charge of piracy was deemed unproven. But his home was still far away, and getting there was oh so difficult. He had to cross lands inhabited by numerous hostile Indian tribes. One night, a dozen Indian horsemen caught up with Glass. They were the Pawnee Indians, and Glass was taken prisoner again. At first, the Indians wanted to burn him alive, but for some unknown reason, they left him alive. For 3 years, he lived among the Pawnee, where, incidentally, he learned a lot, including the skills of life in the wild, which later served him very well. The Indians began to treat him as one of their tribe. Hugh Glass learned the language and possibly several other Indian dialects, and generally felt quite good in their company. In 1821, Hugh Glass arrived in St. Louis with a diplomatic mission of the Pawnee Indians and decided to stay in the city. But less than a year had passed when he saw an advertisement in a newspaper for the recruitment of people for an expedition up the Missouri River to new, unexplored lands. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company was recruiting hunters, guides, and simply adventurers willing to go in search of adventure in unexplored lands and promised big profits. There were plenty of such fellows, and already at the beginning of 1823, a detachment of 100 people called Ashley's 100, after General Ashley, who was the main man in this company, set off on a campaign. It must be understood that their expedition was no easy walk. The lack of roads, the wild terrain, the various animals, the harsh climate, and most importantly, their path lay through the lands of hostile Indian tribes. Very soon there was a clash with the Arikara Indians, who killed and wounded several trappers, including our hero. He was shot in the leg. The group sent for reinforcements, and after a few months, a detachment of soldiers arrived. And only then was the group able to move on. At the head of a small detachment, which included Hugh Glass, stood Major Andrew Henry. He led his men up the Grand River to the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, where Fort Henry was located. This fort was to be the base of the entire expedition. There were only a few weeks left to the fort when our hero was very unlucky again. As I mentioned, the trappers were valued as good guides, and Glass was one of the most experienced guides in the detachment. He walked first, chose the path, chose the place for an overnight stay, was the leader of the group. And so at the end of August 1823, at the fork of the Grand River in a deep forest not far from the riverbank, he alone came across a she-bear with cubs. It was a grown animal, almost 2.5 meters tall and weighing 400 kilograms. The she-bear reared up on its hind legs before attacking, and Hugh realized that this was his last chance. He fired a shot, hoping to hit her in the heart and stop the beast. This was still the era of single-shot rifles, and he simply had no second chance. But the shot did not stop the bear. In a matter of seconds, Glass was on the ground. While he was trying to get his knife from his belt, the she-bear tore at him with her claws and teeth. She tore his jacket skin and flesh to shreds. He screamed in agony, trying to crawl into the bushes, but the she-bear held him with her teeth. Help arrived when Hugh was already unconscious. The bear was on top of him, pressing down with its carcass, and was dead. His comrades pulled the beast's carcass off and realized that our hero was in very bad shape. It was immediately noticeable that his leg was broken. The torn wounds on his back exposed his ribs, and parallel furrows from the she-bear's 10-centimeter claws ran across his entire face and chest. Hugh was half scalped. His scalp was held in place only by a narrow strip on his forehead, and his right arm was also badly injured. But the worst was his throat. It was torn down to the trachea, and with each breath, air escaped with a whistle, and large bloody bubbles swelled over the wound. Major Henry bandaged his eyes and roughly sewed up the largest wounds, tore his shirt, and tied the remnants of the scalp back to his skull. But it was clear to everyone that he had only a few days to live. This story was not uncommon for the expedition. People there died regularly from diseases, snake bites, wild animal attacks, and clashes with Indians. However, it was decided not to leave the wounded man, although they could have. But it should be understood that in those days on the frontier, there were not so many white people, and they practically all knew each other. And returning to civilization, in some bar, they could be asked about their comrade whom they had left to die in the wild. It should also be remembered that the officers who led this company were still more or less gentlemen in those days, and such an act was unworthy of their honor. Therefore, they made a stretcher for our hero and carried him with them. One of the expedition participants, the chirurgeon Allen, recalls in his memoirs. Allen recalled that Major Henry ordered branches to be cut down for the stretcher, and they carried the drowning, bloody man for 2 days or more. Whatever the distance, it was too little, too painful, and too long, and the detachment was in a hurry because winter was approaching. It was the best time to lock themselves in a safe fort and start hunting. After all, that's why the fur company sent them there, and every day of downtime meant expenses and large costs. Besides, Hugh Glass was not getting better. He was getting worse and worse. Then Major Henry made a difficult decision. He left Glass with 2 men so that they, after waiting for his death, would arrange a funeral with full honors. The adventurers John Fitzgerald and the young guy Jim Bridger volunteered. For 5 long days, these guys honestly kept watch by the freshly dug grave, waiting for Hugh Glass to finally take his last breath. However, he was in no hurry to die. John and Jim began to get nervous as they were in the lands of the Arikara Indians, with whom there were traditionally constant clashes, and 2 lone white hunters were easy prey for them. Young Jim, who was only 19 years old, did not want to leave Glass until he died. However, Fitzgerald persuaded him while he took all of our hero's belongings, as he said, in order to prove to the major that Glass was dead. Glass didn't need a rifle, powder, shot, knife, or a bag with flint and steel in the grave. If they hadn't taken all these things, as Fitzgerald claimed, someone would have certainly asked why they left such wealth in the wild forest. In those days, people didn't throw away such expensive things as a rifle. For a good rifle, they could easily be killed, which often happened. When 5 Indian hunters on horseback appeared on the horizon, the trappers did not tempt fate. They pushed Glass, who was unconscious, into the dug grave, sprinkled him with leaves, and rushed to catch up with Henry's detachment. But, as you probably already guessed, Glass was in no hurry to die. After a few days, he woke up in his grave. His whole body ached unbearably. He was hungry and thirsty. There was no one around to help him. In moments of clarity, he plucked berries from an overhanging bush, crushing them with his palm. He managed to pour a little liquid into his damaged throat. For several days, he could do nothing but this. Then luck returned to him. He woke up and saw a rattlesnake nearby. He killed it with a stone and finally chopped the raw meat, so finely that it could be swallowed without chewing. Having gained strength from the meat, he decided it was time. He rolled onto his knees but quickly found that he could not stand. The only way to salvation was Fort Kiowa, which was 320 kilometers from him. This was their starting point. He had to move, but he couldn't move. Just a few days ago, he was going to die. He began to crawl using his one healthy arm and one healthy leg, which the bear had not reached. Thus, he covered 2 or 3 kilometers a day. Gradually, he began to feel better, and breaking off a stick for himself, he made crutches and began to move faster. The daylight was inexorably shortening. Winter was approaching. Each night became colder and colder, and there was nothing to warm himself with. Here, the skills he had acquired living with the Pawnee Indians came in handy. He made fire by friction using a bow method, which is sometimes called an Indian fiddle. Sometimes he would set traps for rabbits made from improvised materials. Sometimes he would come across something that could at least slightly replenish his strength. As he later recounted, his greatest luck during this difficult journey was the remains of a bison carcass that he had taken away from a pack of wolves with a torch made of burning sagebrush. At the same time, it must be remembered that he was constantly forced to hide from Indian detachments. When he reached Fort Kiowa, he was met with incredible surprise. At the threshold stood a real living dead man, skin and bones, scars across his entire face and back, teeming with disgusting white worms that had started in deep, non-healing wounds. You probably already guessed that simply forgiving those guys who left him to die was not quite in the character of our hero, and he went to take revenge. Moreover, according to the unwritten code of the frontier, no one should have prevented him from doing so. What angered him most was that they had taken everything that could have helped him survive: his rifle, knife, and flint. Having barely reached Fort Kiowa, he began to prepare for departure. Glass wanted to get to Fort Henry, where he was going to find Bridger and Fitzgerald to kill them on the spot. Just a few days after his arrival, having barely recovered from his wounds and having slightly satisfied his hunger, Glass sets off north. The journey to Fort Henry took only a month, but he found it abandoned. The Major had moved even further north to the Bighorn River, where the hunt promised to be more successful. At the fort, he tells his story to the representatives of the French company, which hires him in a new detachment that is sent up the Missouri River to resume trade. But Glass does not manage to reach his goal again. The Indians attacked the pirogue, and the river and people began to flee in panic. On the far bank, Glass hid behind stones, from where he saw how Moora and Chetamana, participants in his new expedition, were hacked to pieces by the Indians. He did not know what happened to the others. Moreover, he lost his new rifle, which the French had given him. He squatted down and waited for darkness, then slipped away again, alone. He went up the Missouri River. As he later recounted, "Although I lost my rifle and my booty, I felt quite rich when I found my knife, flint, and steel." These little things make a man feel good when you're 400 miles from any kind of civilization. A few weeks later, on the doorstep of a small fort that served as Henry's new refuge, Hugh Glass appeared in a swirl of snow. It's hard to imagine the reaction of those gathered inside, for Bridger and Fitzgerald had reported to the Major that Glass had died in their arms and had been buried according to all the customs. And here he stood on the threshold, alive and almost unharmed. In the next second, Jim Bridger was on the floor, and Glass began to beat him savagely, but did not kill him, and everyone present did not interfere with him. As I said, according to the unwritten code of the frontier, such actions deserved punishment. With Fitzgerald, things were more complicated. He had fled from Henry's detachment alone, even before Glass arrived, and had enlisted in the U.S. Army to avoid a prison sentence for old sins. When Glass found him, it turned out that he was quite safely serving on the northwestern borders of the United States. Fitzgerald returned Glass's expensive Kentucky rifle, which he had taken when he left Glass to die in the forest. However, Fitzgerald never received the deserved punishment. Hugh Glass did not dare to confront the U.S. Army. It would have meant the gallows for him. However, as Hugh Glass himself later recalled, the fact that he returned his rifle and a heavy purse of money collected by sympathetic military men calmed him down. Apparently, Glass was simply bought off. After all this, Glass did not abandon his usual occupation and continued to accompany hunting parties on the Missouri and other rivers in the region. He became famous not only for his incredible luck and will to live, but also for his hunting skills, which allowed him to obtain much more fur than other hunters. But Hugh Glass's old enemies, the Arikara Indians, finally caught up with him 10 years after this story. In the winter of 1833, along with his two companions, he was killed and scalped on the Yellowstone River. But his killers did not go unpunished. Later, these Arikara, posing as allied Minotari Indians, joined one of the American Fur Company's parties as guides. However, in those days, as I have already mentioned, there were relatively few trappers and mountain men, and almost all of them knew each other. And the observant trapper, Johnson Gardner, noticed the same expensive Kentucky rifle of Glass in the hands of one of the Indians. After interrogation, the Indians confessed and were executed on the spot. Such is the story of a life filled with survival and overcoming. Hugh Glass did not remain unknown. He left a big mark on American culture. He became one of the characters in Robert Zelazny's novel, and more recently, a film called The Revenant was made based on this story, for which DiCaprio received an Oscar.